What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some of the best indie titles that I played and reviewed throughout this year. As new releases finally start to wind down a little bit, I've kind of been going over everything I've played and simply decided to look back on some of those smaller titles, which truth be told made up the bulk of what I reviewed this year, as there were really only a handful of larger releases. So this year, for me at least, was a lot of older titles and a lot of smaller games. Their size notwithstanding, many of those smaller games were, in fact, I think, great experiences that are worth sharing and talking about, and thus, here we are. Now, that said, probably important to mention that I am focused on games that released this year, as well as being full game releases. So I think there were some cool games that released into early access, and while they're neat, I'm not really including those. What's more, while I'm going to provide a quick synopsis of some of these games here, I have reviewed all of them, so if you want to just search the channel for those, if you're looking for more information, that is certainly an option for you. But with that out of the way, let's actually dive into some of this. So first up, we have Another Crab's Treasure. Genuinely one of my better gaming experiences this year, period. Another Crab's Treasure is a Souls-like, or a Shoals-like as I've come to appreciate. This one puts us in the role of a hermit crab who has lost its shell and must go on an adventure of self-discovery in order to recover that shell, while also contending with all sorts of dangers down in the depths below. This includes all sorts of traditional Souls-like boss fights and everything, and tough encounters, while obviously being very humorous on top of that. And what's more, this is actually a really good story. I was mostly just having a good laugh, only for it to punch you in the stomach right at the end of it. And even if Souls-likes aren't normally your thing here, Another Crab's Treasure has a bunch of different options you can adjust, but I would say probably most noteworthy is the fact that you can equip just a gun, and the gun's special property is one-shotting everything, which was really funny all on its own. But for all of those reasons, I thought this game was great, and I would love to see more people play it and experience it, because it really is worth it. Moving along though, next up we have Pacific Drive. So Pacific Drive released early on in the year, February I think, but I didn't get to it until a few months after that. But I knew I had to circle around to play it again because I enjoyed it so much. Now I will say this is a game that has a really fantastic opening 5 to 10 hours, but then starts to fall off a bit as you move towards the end, which isn't helped along by the fact that this is effectively a roguelike where you drive a car through a supernatural zone looking for an escape route, essentially, while dodging all sorts of supernatural and paranormal anomalies and other issues. And it's clearly inspired by plenty of other games, but in a way that feels both surprisingly cozy while managing to keep you on your toes at the same time. And between upgrading your garage, the car itself, there's plenty to do in the game, but I would say realistically the best part about it is those first few opening hours when you're kind of getting to grips with everything, because the story does kind of peter out towards the end for sure. But nonetheless, it was a unique experience, and when you review as many games as I do, that certainly is saying something. But that does bring us to number 3 on the list, and this one is the Thaumaturge, which puts us in the role of a thaumaturge in early 20th century Warsaw, Poland. In particular, though, our job is effectively to track down people who are emotionally haunted by salutors, or demons effectively, and we're going to collect those demons, allowing us to use them in the game's turn-based combat system, which was interesting, and that on top of an especially interesting narrative makes this game a really noteworthy one for sure. And while I've certainly seen the mechanics of everything here in other places, the setting and aesthetic of it was certainly very interesting and definitely one of the more memorable games I've played this year. And between optimizing your fights with the demons and the multiple endings through the story and all sorts of little, I would say, Easter eggs for lack of a better term, to show off things like, say, Krampus even, which I thought was great. And overall, I'd say it's just a really cool indie title, and I think if you manage to find the time, it's a pretty interesting one. But that does bring us to, I would say for me at least, the start of the 2 standout indie titles that I really wanted to talk about. And first up we have Skald. Skald is a Lovecraftian RPG that does a lot of things fantastically well. Now this is obviously inspired by games like Ultima and whatnot, but it is really well done. I would say for me the biggest drawback really was that visually it can be sometimes hard to parse, especially in combat. But between the various ways you can build your character, the classes you can pick, the teammates and companions you can pick up, and the fights against eldritch horrors you can undergo, with a few even having some, I would say, mild choice and consequence in there, makes for a really great title. Now, on one hand, I would say this game is definitely indie, so relatively small in scope, which to my mind can sometimes see it struggle a little bit to actually reach some of its ambitions, but as long as that doesn't bother you, I think Skald is a tremendous game that punches well above its weight. And while the art style and everything will definitely be, off-putting for some people after all, if you're willing to get past that, a tremendous game here. But that does bring us to our final entry, and that is Dread Delusion. Dread Delusion released back in May, and I initially heard about it a bit before that. I think it had like an early access period or something, but the reason I kept hearing about it is because everyone kept comparing it to Morrowind, which is honestly a terrible comparison, and outside of some of the general visuals being somewhat bizarre in nature, it's really not much like Morrowind at all. Outside of the fact that it is perhaps simply another great RPG you could play with an especially interesting world. Honestly, I would say the world is really the highlight, and then how you can learn to explore it, but there's even a house you can buy and upgrade to use as a base of operations while you attempt to cut your way through these bizarre creatures that almost kind of look like eldritch horrors, and there's even some old gods of the land that the apostate union has sworn to defeat because they tend to bring nothing but suffering in exchange for what are seemingly like Faustian bargains, more or less. And that's before you even start getting into the different factions of the game, like the immortal undead kingdom that has to eat synthetic flesh lest it go on crusades against everyone else, which is honestly kind of bizarre because if you destroy their body entirely, their sort of consciousness still doesn't die. That's how immortal they are. But life without a body, being described as essentially hell for them, makes it undesirable, especially since their actual bodies are rotting away. And there are multiple other kingdoms and things to explore, and it's just such a great overall experience. Now really, I would say the only downside to it is that combat is very basic and very easy. There's a hard mode for the game, but it really doesn't add much in terms of difficulty, so while there are different ways you can play and things like that, none of it really ever amounts to much, and it does kind of make the combat-oriented options feel a little underwhelming because once you know what you're doing, this just isn't likely an area you're going to struggle with or even really be challenged all that much. But I do think it makes up for that just in terms of the world again, but also the exploration of that world. And it's certainly worth it for that, if nothing else. But I do believe that is where we're going to wrap up this particular video. There's been a handful of indie titles that I thought were especially great here in 2024. So by all means, let me know what you think about these down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.